Welcome to our presentation on ketogenic therapy, the pilot study results, and a panel discussion with researchers and subjects. So for those of you who are new to CMHRC, my name is Elizabeth Errico. I am CMHRC's Executive Director and founder, and I was the principal investigator on our recently concluded pilot study looking at the effects of ketogenic therapy on symptoms of bipolar disorder in children aged 6 to 17. This research study aligns with our mission as an organization because we are here to provide guidance and resources for the early identification and management of mood disorders, bipolar disorder, and its newly recognized phenotype known as fear of harm, called thermoregulatory sleep dysregulation disorder. Ketogenic therapy is an at-home intervention for mental illnesses that reduces symptom severity and intensity, and it can have a life-saving impact on the trajectory of mental illness. So the study that we just completed was an examination of the symptoms of bipolar disorder in children aged 6 to 17 as part of what we called the Ketogenic Therapy in Action Program, which was a comprehensive ketogenic therapy, psychoeducation, and support program. My co-investigator, Jana Cupp, and our advisor, Georgia Eid, who's the author of Change Your Diet, Change Your Mind, and our other two advisors, dietitians Beth Zupek-Kania and Denise Potter, worked with us to create a comprehensive program for families to follow so that they could understand not only the science behind ketogenic therapy, but also the practicality of how to implement it. After I share with you the fascinating information on what we learned during this study, I'm going to introduce you to three parents who participated in this study with their children to hear about their lived experience in the study. So, our learning objectives for this presentation are to describe what ketogenic therapy is, identify background and purpose for the study, examine both quantitative and qualitative data from the study, identify areas for further investigation, and describe the personal lived experience with participant families. We're going to get started now with describing what ketogenic therapy is. So we're going to start with a few simple statements that can summarize in the broadest possible terms what ketogenic therapy is. First, ketogenic therapy is a way of eating that creates ketones, which the body and brain use as a plentiful energy source to replace glucose. Ketones are an important part of the body's energy system, and the brain and the body can run on both glucose for energy or on ketones. And in actuality, ketones can be a more efficient fuel source than glucose, in part because it reduces inflammation and reduces the oxidative stress on the brain. While the brain and the body do continue to need some glucose, it doesn't actually have to come from the food that you eat. The body can make all of the glucose that it needs by converting the fat and protein consumed into glucose. Next, ketogenic therapy is a high-fat food plan balanced with protein and with limited carbohydrates. People seeing this often get a little concerned about the high levels of fat that are eaten on ketogenic therapy because most of us have been conditioned by the diet industry to think that eating fat makes us fat, which it does not, in fact, do. In ketogenic therapy, the high levels of fat eaten are required. They're necessary for the body to be able to make the ketones necessary to reach and maintain a level of therapeutic ketones, which we call ketosis. Another concern that some people have is actually quite improbable. It's a condition called ketoacidosis. This is most commonly referred to as diabetic ketoacidosis, and it's improbable as an outcome for ketogenic therapy for anyone who's not a type 1 diabetic. Ketoacidosis occurs when both ketone levels and glucose levels are extremely high and rise simultaneously. This is an urgent medical condition and requires evaluation by medical professionals immediately. However, because ketogenic therapy increases fat while significantly limiting carbs, the body uses the fat for energy and ketone production, and the glucose levels actually go down, reducing the risk for something like ketoacidosis to occur. Next, we need to talk a tiny bit about what ketogenic therapy isn't. It's not a diet. Its purpose is not for weight loss. Its purpose is not for weight gain. Its purpose is not for muscle building or any of the other things that you may have seen influencers online talking about as keto being a high protein, low carb diet. Ketogenic therapy is a high fat food plan. Again, it's balanced with protein and has very limited carbohydrates so that your body can create the ketones that it needs. So you might be wondering why we want those ketones instead of glucose as the energy source during ketogenic therapy. The purpose of ketogenic therapy is to achieve and maintain, as I said, a state of medical or nutritional ketosis in order to reduce the presence, frequency, and severity of the symptoms of mental illness or other illnesses that have been studied. Ketogenic therapy is not actually a new idea. In fact, it has been used for over 100 years in the treatment of epilepsy in people of all ages, children included. It even is used in children as young as infancy. So before there were medications to treat seizures, doctors had to find other interventions to stop that seizure activity. And in 1915, Dr. John Howland from Johns Hopkins observed that fasting seemed to reduce seizures. And so he came up with a hypothesis that to stop seizures, we needed to discover a way to consume food that mimics the metabolic effects of fasting. In 1921, Dr. Russell Wilder at the Mayo Clinic developed what's now known as the ketogenic diet as a nutritional treatment for epilepsy that would mimic the metabolic effects of fasting. It would also produce the ketones that the brain and the body could then use for energy that did not cause inflammation in the brain. The new therapeutic model wound up reducing seizure frequency by about 50% or more in epilepsy patients, 30% or more of whom went on to have no additional seizures for the remainder of their life, even after stopping the therapy. Now, applications of ketogenic therapy have evolved, and in the last 15 years or so, research has really dug into focusing on how to use it to treat mental health conditions. The disorders that have been studied significantly include schizophrenia and schizoaffective disorder, bipolar disorders, depression, and anxiety. In 2024, there was a landmark study by Dr. Shibani Sethi at Stanford Medical School examining the use of ketogenic therapy as a metabolic treatment for adult patients with schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. This study has caused quite a stir because of the significant findings that this type of therapy can meaningfully reduce symptoms. Also in 2024, here at CHMRC, my colleague Jana Kupp and I launched the first study to examine the impact of ketogenic therapy in children with bipolar disorder to see what impact this nutritional therapy would have on their bipolar disorder symptoms. Now, in epilepsy treatment, the classic therapy is broken down based on how much fat to protein to carbohydrates are eaten. This is called a macro ratio. It is often very high, at a 4-to-1 ratio for classic keto. This requires that 90% of calories come from fat, with 6% coming from protein and only 4% coming from carbohydrates. As you can see, this graphic lists other ratios, including 3-to-1 and 1-to-1, and of course, the higher 4-to-1 ratio. Since the macro ratio variable depends upon the purpose of the intervention, it is important to understand how that ratio is calculated. The macro ratio is calculated in a simple arithmetic problem where the total grams of fat are divided by the combined number of the total grams of protein and the total grams of carbohydrates. Initially, this can feel somewhat confusing, and it can be hard to picture what a meal with a 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 or even 4-to-1 macronutrient ratio looks like, or what it tastes like for that matter. So thankfully, it's actually quite simple once you become familiar. And here is a sample dinner at a 3-to-1 macro ratio. It's broccoli, steak, butter, and olive oil. This meal has 3 times more fat than protein plus carbohydrates combined. Also, it is important to remember, as I said before, that in ketogenic therapy, you don't have to be concerned about this high level of fat. In fact, it is essential to consume these high levels of fat on ketogenic therapy because it is the fat that is required to make the necessary ketones. Your body is using this fat rather than storing it away because it might need it later. So this is what a typical day of eating for a child following ketogenic therapy might look like. Breakfast could be an egg yolk waffle with butter and 2 links of breakfast sausage. Lunch, a yogurt parfait made with full-fat plain yogurt with 3 tablespoons of heavy cream mixed in, 1/4 cup of blackberries, and 1/3 cup of keto granola. Dinner could be 6 tuna melt nuggets, 1/2 cup of cauliflower with ranch dip. As you can see, this includes a variety of foods, including meats, dairy, fish, fruits, vegetables, seeds, and nuts. These foods are healthy and packed with vitamins and minerals and balanced nutrition that people of any age need. Now, that menu might still be overwhelming to you. You may think, I don't know what an egg yolk waffle even is. Or you might be thinking to yourself, I really hate cooking. I don't want to have to make all of that. But Dr. Georgia Ede, who I mentioned at the beginning, metabolic psychiatrist and author of Change Your Diet, Change Your Mind, reminds us that a ketogenic food plan is any way of eating that allows an individual to achieve and maintain a state of ketosis. Ideally, it will be made up of whole foods. Ketogenic therapy is focused on achieving and maintaining that state of ketosis when the body is using ketones for its fuel. This is a biological state, and the goal is to get to that state and to stay there in ketosis. It's less focused on exactly which foods are being eaten by which person. And one person's ketogenic therapy food plan may look very different from the next person's ketogenic therapy food plan, despite the fact that they're both in a state of ketosis. Ketosis can be achieved when you cook at home. It can be achieved when you are snacking throughout the day instead of eating formal meals. And it can even be achieved and maintained if you eat out at restaurants frequently. Research has shown that ketogenic therapy provides immediate access to an effective treatment intervention that doesn't require a doctor's prescription, and it can be implemented at home, which is especially important for individuals and communities that have difficulty accessing mental health care. Research from the National Institutes of Mental Health shows that there is an average 10-year treatment onset delay. Now, that's between when a family first identifies that their child needs mental health support until they receive an accurate diagnosis and effective treatment. 10 years is way too long. 10 years is a childhood lost. Research also shows that systemic racism and unconscious bias constitute a barrier to access for both physical and mental health care. When we add this to that average 10-year treatment onset delay, we recognize that BIPOC communities are often left behind and unable to access necessary services. Many people might also think that a food plan like ketogenic therapy is out of reach because it's made up of animal proteins and healthy fats and fresh vegetables. They conclude that it must be much more expensive. In fact, it's one of the first things people push back on when ketogenic therapy is suggested. It's cost. If it is, in fact, so much more expensive, it would go further to marginalizing those in lower socioeconomic groups from accessing treatment. But ketogenic therapy is not necessarily any more expensive than the standard American diet, and socioeconomic status does not need to be a barrier to entry for following ketogenic therapy. Data from the 2024 census shows that American families spend between $950 and $1,436 per month on their groceries. The lowest total there is coming from Wisconsin, and the highest coming from right here in Hawaii. Researchers at Children's Mercy Hospital in Kansas City did an analysis of the average grocery costs associated with ketogenic therapy and estimated the costs per month per child to be $143 to $185. That means that for a family of 6, the grocery bills on ketogenic therapy do not have to be any higher than existing US averages. Unfortunately, even though ketogenic therapy is financially viable for most families, there are still significant challenges for millions of Americans in terms of simply accessing grocery stores that sell fresh, perishable foods. The term food desert was coined in the early 1990s and refers to areas of the country where the distance between where people live and a grocery store that sells fresh perishable food makes it difficult or impossible to access healthy food. In an urban setting where people tend not to have cars, that distance is 1 mile, whereas in rural settings where people are assumed to have access to vehicles, the typical distance is 10 miles. There are over 6,500 geographic areas that are designated as food deserts in the United States, and more than 5.6% of the US population lives in one of those food deserts. Lack of access to fresh, perishable foods in a grocery store, those lack of access rates are 30% higher for BIPOC communities than they are for white communities. This has to change in order to provide true equal access to nutritional therapies. Now, our second learning objective, which is identify the background and purpose for our study. So our ketogenic therapy study had 2 goals in mind. The first was to examine the effects of ketogenic therapy on the symptoms of bipolar disorder in pediatric patients. And we assessed these based on reported quality of life measures for the child and the family. The second goal we had in mind was to identify the supports that a family would need in order to successfully adopt and maintain ketogenic therapy for a child in their care with bipolar disorder. The goal there was to improve overall quality of life for the child and their entire family. Now, folks who live with juvenile onset bipolar disorder know that it is an under-recognized and under-treated illness. More than 1 million children and adolescents are diagnosed with bipolar disorder in the United States. However, the National Institutes of Mental Health, their research report shows that nearly 1/3 of the 3.4 million children and adolescents who are diagnosed with major depression are actually misdiagnosed, and that they actually have some form of early onset bipolar disorder, which means that that is another million children and teens who do not have an accurate diagnosis. Bipolar spectrum disorders are estimated to affect as many as 3% of all children and 7% of all children who are receiving outpatient psychiatric care. The pervasive and pernicious misconception that children cannot have or be diagnosed with bipolar disorder means that millions of children don't get accurately diagnosed until they're 18, 19, 20 years old, or even further into adulthood. This has dire consequences for this community because estimates suggest that as many as 60% of people with bipolar disorder at some point attempt to end their lives, which makes bipolar disorder a threat to their very survival. Additionally, up to 38.9% of the entire pediatric population, not just those with mental health conditions, but the entire pediatric population of the United States, have some form of metabolic dysfunction. Now, this is especially concerning for children with mental health conditions because the antipsychotic medications that they are frequently prescribed can cause metabolic dysfunction. Unfortunately, these antipsychotics are often given to pediatric patients instead of the gold standard treatment medications like mood stabilizers. So in our study, the subjects who met the completion criteria spent 4 weeks transitioning to a ketogenic food plan and then spent 20 weeks adhering to that plan. Their individual macro ratios ranged from as low as 0.75 to 1 up to 2.1, and each day they tracked what they ate, their blood ketone and blood glucose levels, as well as details on their symptom severity. Each month, they completed assessments evaluating their presence of depressive symptoms, manic symptoms, aggressive symptoms, sleep disruptions, and obsessive compulsive symptoms, all of which are common symptoms present in the pediatric onset bipolar disorder. The subjects in our study who met the completion criteria additionally were offered ongoing virtual support from the study staff, as well as communal opportunities to connect with their fellow participants through weekly group psychoeducation sessions and support sessions, as well as through moderated private online groups and communication settings. These virtual groups were all conducted face-to-face so that people were able to meet one another and break down the isolation that they experienced as parents of children living with serious mental health conditions. So now I'm going to share the results with you, and they are quite something. So in our next learning objective, we're going to look at both the qualitative and quantitative data we collected. On validated measures of 5 symptoms common to pediatric bipolar, 100% of the subjects who met the completion criteria showed meaningful improvement. I'm going to say that again so that we all appreciate how remarkable this is. 100% of the subjects who followed the protocol saw improvement. The two main categories of symptoms in bipolar disorder are, of course, depression and mania, and as rated on the Beck Depression Inventory and the Young Mania Rating Scale, both sets of symptoms dropped by an average of 76%. Averages in aggression dropped by 58%, sleep disruptions dropped by 51%, and obsessive compulsive behaviors dropped by an average of 42%. Importantly, all 5 measures show what we call statistical significance, with the depressive symptoms and the obsessive compulsive symptoms reducing with a p-value less than 0.05, and mania, aggression, and sleep disruptions improved with a p-value of less than 0.01. Now, what this means is that with depression and obsessive compulsive symptoms, there was less than a 5% chance that these results occurred by chance. And in mania, aggression, and sleep disruptions, there was less than a 1% chance that these changes took place as a result of something other than the intervention that we were testing. So we can say with confidence that these results occurred as a result of ketogenic therapy. The effect was real. This is incredibly compelling evidence for researchers and for families. One of the parents in the study shared with us that prior to this study, day-to-day life was sneaked conversations away from earshot, hiding knives, covering our ears, utter exhaustion, angry attacks, a hostage situation for us, siblings, and our pets. Thankfully, we hit ketosis early and stayed in it for 99% of the study. Our lives have changed dramatically, and the child we mourned is not, in fact, dead after all. Who our child was before the onset is still all there, and with each passing day returns. Another parent shared that ketogenic therapy was the only treatment or therapy to produce noticeable benefits for their child in the child's entire life. Ketogenic therapy completely stopped the cycling and other bipolar symptoms. Sleep improved immediately after entering ketosis, and for the first time in their child's life, sleeping through the night became the norm. Ketogenic therapy has been an answer to our prayers, they told us, and I can say with confidence that my child's prognosis is now bright. Based on the analysis, our preliminary quantitative results are that sustained ketosis at or above 0.8 millimolars per liter for 16 weeks or more reduces bipolar disorder symptoms, with averages of 76% reductions in depression and mania, 58% reductions in aggression, 51% improvements or reductions in sleep disturbances, and 42% reductions in obsessive compulsive behaviors. And the parents report improved quality of life with overall symptom reductions of 61%. Our preliminary qualitative conclusions are that ketogenic therapy is a feasible lifestyle intervention for children and families when they are given the right amount of support. Part of what made ketogenic therapy sustainable through our specific study was the community aspect that was so heavily woven into the process. Listen to what some of the subjects had to say about the community. The community and psychoed were crucial to our success, but it took me a while to realize how valuable it was. I was too confident about our ability to catch on and be successful. I thought we wouldn't need to rely on the group because we would understand the guidelines and apply them in some way that fit our life. But it actually requires a lot of diligence. I couldn't just wing it. Thank goodness the team and the other participants were there to help us get back on track and stay there. Another participant said, having designated time each week to connect with my ketogenic therapy cohort was the fuel that kept me and my child going along with ketogenic therapy. The dedicated support and psychoeducation was tailored perfectly, and the sessions set us up for success, building confidence and lifelong skills. Doing this in a vacuum, being without the encouragement and connection, would have made it feel impossible. So ketogenic therapy adoption and adherence is eased with frequent and sustained contact and support from experts, as well as from having a strong peer community. So let's look at one specific case presentation to put this into context. This child's symptoms onset at around age 4, and they were diagnosed with bipolar disorder cyclothymia. This child was denied access to the gold standard bipolar disorder treatment, which is lithium or another mood stabilizer, and they had to endure 2 failed ADHD medication trials. Worse, the only medications that the family were given as an option from their prescriber were ADHD medications and SSRI antidepressants, which are contraindicated in the bipolar disorder treatment. Antipsychotic medications were offered, but they can have devastating metabolic effects all on their own. So a prognosis for a child in these circumstances is, generally speaking, not good. But after adopting ketogenic therapy, the changes were staggering. This subject experienced a complete elimination of both depressive and obsessive compulsive symptoms. They had a 90% reduction in both manic symptoms and chronic sleep disruptions, 84% reductions in parent-reported symptom severity and frequency, and 62% reductions in aggression, which is a common and devastating feature of pediatric bipolar disorder that damages family relationships and damages the child's self-esteem. We found that the younger the child, the more easily they adapted to the food plan, and the lower macro ratios were necessary to reach higher levels of ketones. But regardless of age, the children connected ketogenic therapy to feeling better. So once in ketosis, they had an intrinsic motivation to stay on plan. This subject continued with ketogenic therapy after the study ended, and at bedtime asks their mother for the good dreams fat bombs, which were the only things ever to stop this child's nightmares. We did also find that of all of the subjects who completed the completion criteria, all of them continued with the therapy after the study's completion. So we've seen that therapeutic levels of ketosis ease symptoms and improve quality of life for children with bipolar. But achieving and maintaining therapeutic levels of ketosis requires more than just being given information about keto guidelines. Success requires frequent and sustained contact with both experts who guide the subjects and with a strong peer community to help families navigate the unexpected and unavoidable obstacles and complications that can occur along the way. That community also helps break down families' isolation that is caused by persistent stigma against mental illness. The most powerful tool we have in general in terms of ensuring long-term positive outcomes for mental illness is early intervention and management. And ketogenic therapy may very well be one of the most promising early intervention tools that we have, helping children avoid traumatic hospitalizations, unnecessary or contraindicated medication trials, and the side effects that go along with both. What we've seen is that it is the combination of ketosis and community that has brought hope to families who have not had a place to turn for far too long. Given the stakes, we are not ending the research here. So we're now going to identify some areas for further study. The next phase of our inquiry is based on the fact that while children were able to identify the connection between ketogenic therapy and feeling better, they also worried about what would happen if they ever stopped following the therapy. They wanted to know, will my symptoms return if I stop ketogenic therapy? And so the next phase of inquiry that we're embarking on is that we're going to repeat our 6-month pilot program with many, many more families. Then we're going to go beyond by entering into a 3-year data collection period where we're going to follow these families as they engage in 2 years of strict ketogenic therapy, followed by 1 year or more of a more relaxed keto food plan without weighing and measuring or logging any of the foods, assuming that by now you know what you're doing and you just have the opportunity to do it. After that, we're going to follow families for an additional 5 years to see how many of them opted to stay on ketogenic therapy, how many opted to stop. And for those who do stop, do the symptoms recur? We'll explore whether ketogenic therapy is like a medication where it only works while you're taking it, or if ketogenic therapy can have a reparative effect on the brain and allow patients to go back to their previous ways of eating and maintain psychiatric symptom remission. Now we're going to meet a few of the persevering parents who participated in our study, parents who do hard things and surmount challenges every day in the pursuit of stability for and improved quality of life for their children. But before we do, I want to share just a few resources. So these resources can help you find more information about ketogenic therapy, from books to cookbooks to websites with free information on metabolic health, illness, and the use of metabolic therapies and ketogenic therapy. On these 3 slides, you will find the references that were used in the creation of this presentation. And finally, I want to take a moment to acknowledge our gratitude for the leadership at Bazuki Group for their vision, commitment, and financial support of this study, to our dietitian advisors, Beth Zupek-Kania and Denise Potter, and our metabolic psychiatrist advisor, Dr. Georgia Eade, for all their consultation, to Stephanie Middlestat and Robert Kopp for their statistical analysis of our results, to CMHRC's board of directors, and perhaps most importantly, to the children and families living with mood disorders who inspire our work every day. So before we turn things over to our participant panel, I want to remind everybody that if you would like to take a deeper dive into this and be able to speak directly with panelists, please join us for our free discussion group on next Tuesday evening, October 21st, from 7 to 8 p.m. Eastern Time. You can use this QR code to register for that event. Again, that is entirely free of charge and an opportunity to continue this discussion in a smaller setting. So now I'm going to stop this screen share and invite my very special guests onto screen with me. They are parents who participated in our ketogenic therapy study, and they are going to share with you some of their experiences. So I will start out by actually, I'm going to give you each the opportunity to introduce yourself. So, Angela, I'm just going to go around my screen. Why don't you go ahead and get started?
Yes, hi, I'm Angela, and we were part of cohort number 1 of the study. I have 5 children in my home, 2 of which have bipolar. Only one of them was part of the study, and we really had just reached the point of we've tried everything. Professionals are not listening to us, and we didn't know what else to do. We were tired of walking on eggshells, tired of constant battles, and this was kind of like a last-ditch effort to try and bring some stability to our home.
Thank you, Angela. Carrie?
Hi, my name is Carrie Kelly, and I have 2 children. My oldest is the one that was participating in cohort 1. And my background is in engineering. My child was so symptomatic that I took a break from my career in his infancy and have just been on a relentless investigation for what is causing his problems. It's been so mysterious to his doctors, to teachers, other moms that have tried to help. I started looking into, once I learned about bipolar disorder and realized that his symptoms fit, I started obsessively researching about the causes of it, and found out that there were some theories and some more research coming out just in the last couple of years about the metabolic origin of mental illness. Then I read those two books that were listed, Dr. Ead's book as well as Dr. Palmer's book, and I thought, this must be it. So we were ready to seek a dietitian, and we even knew that was going to be hard because just finding anybody who would believe us about our son's symptoms was difficult. But to find a dietitian that would lead us in this ketogenic therapy, we thought we have to at least try. And I was just absolutely thrilled when CMHRC announced this study. So I think I was the very first one to shoot my hand up, and I'm so glad that we did.
Thank you, Carrie. Alyssa?
Hi, my name's Alyssa. My husband and I adopted our son, and we noticed, looking back, symptoms of bipolar much earlier than what we were able to get him diagnosed with. And we felt like that we had tried pretty much everything and anything to help his symptoms. And there still wasn't quite the relief that we were hoping for. So when this study came out, we were up for it and very glad that we did.
Thank you, Alyssa. All right, so we've heard about the results, sort of generally speaking, and they were very exciting. But I know that one of the things that people want to know is, how hard is it actually? So I'm wondering if you three can share your thoughts on the obstacles that you faced in terms of adopting ketogenic therapy, and what made them worth overcoming, because it's a tough task to change the way a child eats. Angela, why don't you get started? And I'm going to let everyone know that feel free to put your questions into the Q&A. I will integrate your questions into our conversation as we go, so you can get some of your questions answered right now.
For us, my daughter is a teenager. And so before we even began, we had to get her agreement. Nothing was going to happen without her saying, all right, sure, I'll try. And even at the very beginning, I remember having conversations with you, Elizabeth, and other members of the team and saying, hey, look, I'm not sure that this is going to go well. I don't want to ruin your study when it doesn't happen. So just getting her buy-in right off the bat was difficult. And even once we got started, even though she said, oh yeah, I'll try, she's a teenager and she wanted autonomy. She didn't want to look different from everyone else. She didn't want to be the only one doing something. So we had a lot of those battles of, listen, it's okay that you're not eating the same thing that everyone else is eating. You don't have to be like everyone else. And just really trying to work through those pieces was hard. And it actually is why I now also do keto, because we had the whole conversation of, no one understands, no one does this. And I was like, okay, you know what? I'll understand. I'll do it with you. But as she got closer and finally got into ketosis, we saw such a drastic change, that the hard was worth every minute. We watched the light come back into her eyes and just enjoy life again. We would spend time looking at pictures, and when she was younger, and we would be like, man, she just looks so sad now, or she doesn't have that sparkle. And we got to see that come back, and that made all of it worth it.
Wow. Carrie?
I'm not entirely sure, but I suspect our child is the youngest participant in the study. Maybe Elizabeth, you can confirm that.
Maybe.
Okay. I'm saying that because I suspect that our success with the study does have to do somewhat with our child's age. He's still fairly young, and so doesn't have a lot of autonomy in the kitchen. We did the whole family went on this therapy together, and so our house was cleansed of any non-keto foods, which made us feel a lot better. To let him peruse the refrigerator, but it also gave him kind of like Angela was saying, it gave him some support. Um, we struggled probably the most with the daily finger pricks, and that was something that we figured out. I started thinking, if my son had type 1 diabetes, this would be something that's just absolutely essential for his health. And then I started thinking like, well, if this therapy is going to do what I suspect it will do based on what all the research I've done, it is going to be life-saving. I need to at least try. So that was the most challenging part for us, was to get him to do the finger pricks. He's been extremely averse to pain his entire life. And so we spoiled him to death with all kinds of goodies and treats after being so brave and doing that. And then within a few weeks, he got used to it. And then by then as well, his symptoms had already started reducing. And so by the end of the study, that was not a problem anymore.
Alyssa?
Well, our son loves all kinds of food, and so the hardest thing I think for us was our son also has autism, and so it was hard for us to help him understand why he couldn't have some foods that he really liked anymore. So that was probably the hardest thing that we had to overcome, and it was really quite manageable with the slow introduction of the changing of the diet and the slow elimination of the foods that he regularly eats. We were able to just say, well, we don't have any of that anymore. We're not buying that. Um, and it wasn't something that we had around, so we didn't have to argue about it. There was no fighting about it. And as he became more stable, and the symptoms were less, then it almost became a non-issue because he could tolerate uh, having us tell him that he can't have that.
So
And
we
then
have a
not even asking
question.
for it.
Oh, okay. So we have a question that came in saying keto's all or nothing, isn't it? Yes and no. You are either in ketosis or you are not in ketosis. So in that sense, it's sort of all or nothing. But we did see from our study that the harm reduction model worked as well. That as carbohydrate increase went down, as carbohydrate intake went down, symptom presentation went down as well. So even for those who didn't meet the completion criteria of being in ketosis for the designated period of time, they still saw some improvement, not as dramatic as those who followed the protocol, but still significant enough that they were able to associate feeling better. So in that sense, it's not ideally, yes, you have to be in ketosis in order to experience the benefits of being in ketosis. But it doesn't necessarily mean that there is no wiggle room in terms of the actual foods that you're eating and when. And that goes along with how is it manageable when the children attend school. Can't imagine my children actually sticking to it when they're away from home. And I want to acknowledge that, yes, that is a challenge. But Alyssa, I'm wondering if you would be willing to tell the story about the day that the school forgot to tell you about the party.
Yes. I think there's a couple. Was this the ice cream one?
Mm-hmm. And
Yes.
the
Okay.
lunch.
Yes. So yeah, uh our son's autism room was having a party one day and they did not inform us about it, and they uh panicked and called me and said, we're having a party today and there's ice cream and we know Cam can't have ice cream, so what should we do? So we we were able to just quick run and get him. I asked what kind of ice cream they were serving, and we were able to go and get him the um, what's it called? Rebel ice cream, the same flavor. And so they just scooped his up the same way that they scooped everybody else's up, and there was no issue. He didn't even really know the difference.
Yeah, and I also want to point out that for some of the kids, they, as I said, they make the connection between the therapy and how they're feeling. And so one of the other subjects had, got to the point where they were old enough, a teenager, where they were looking at what they were eating and looking at the macro ratios and looking to see, if they were noting their ketone levels and making choices intentionally to support that. Looking at saying, well, I need to have some more fat with this meal, or, well, I probably shouldn't have that bag of chips today because I had something else that changed my daily macros. That becomes internalized because they don't want to stop feeling better. And so while kids are going to learn from their experience and have to try it out a couple times and realize, I felt crummy. It was not uncommon for kids to realize that, oh, wow, I really wanted to be a part of the crowd, so I had that thing. And then later, I didn't feel so good. Alyssa, yeah, go ahead.
I want to add a little bit about the all or nothing in the wiggle room and what we found out as we were tracking his food intake and the protein, fat, carbohydrates, that over time we noticed that even if his protein intake was higher than what it should be for the day, we noticed an increase in symptoms. But that didn't mean he couldn't have any of those things. Like he could still, we were able to figure out what he could have to still keep him in ketosis over time. And so, I mean, that was one thing that became easier as well, because we could see, oh, his protein intake was higher today. That's why he was crabby. And then we could work and change it around the next day, or we could see it as the day was going and add fat as it was going. So it is all or nothing, but it isn't at the same time, like you said.
Yeah, Angela, go ahead.
Yeah, I was actually going to speak similarly. We call it through the study bioindividuality. And so we think of a lot of things as they can't have that. But once they get into the plan and they're in ketosis, you really get to learn what they can and can't have, how much they can have, how it's going to affect them. But I did want to speak to the part about how are they going to do it in school. Having a teenager in high school and wanting to look like everyone else, part of the change comes when they are feeling better, right? They're noticing that when I do this, I'm less distracted, I'm less quick to anger. They're noticing those things about themselves, so they want to make those changes. And it wasn't that easy in the beginning. It wasn't that easy at all. But the reality is, even though we like to think about it as this very restrictive plan, there's a lot of things on the plan that are very normal. Right now, it's very cool to take, mini charcuterie boxes for lunch, or, just little bento box of snacks. That's very keto. You have some nuts, you have some cheese, you have some jerky, and so they can eat in a way that truly no one recognizes they're doing something different. And so they figure that out as well. They save the weird stuff, as my daughter would call it, for home. And they take the normal stuff, their peanuts and their cheese stick, on the road with them, for other people to see.
There's a question here about whether or not it would be easier to start a ketogenic diet during school holidays, so it would be easier to change the diet without as much pressure. Could be. Sure. We did not transition these kids fast, right? There are some side effects that can happen called the keto flu, because some of those symptoms are a little bit like the flu symptoms, fatigue, being dizzy, having some stomach distress. And those things can be avoided by a slow transition onto the food plan. So the way we structured it involved moving from the regular way of eating to a ketogenic food plan over the course of a month. That way, none of our subjects wound up experiencing any negative side effects from the transition, either in terms of their stamina or in terms of gastrointestinal effects. So don't recommend anybody do it very quickly, like over a week or two, because that can cause some distress. And you don't want your child to experience that distress, not only because you don't want them to experience distress, but also because it will make them more resistant to continuing, because they won't have that experience of having gotten through the difficult period yet. And so they may be inclined to stop. Whereas if you transition them very slowly, they're able to have a positive experience transitioning and not give up. There's also a question here about celiac. Good news, if you have celiac disease or gluten intolerance, keto is kind of perfect because you can't have any ingredients that have gluten in them when you are on ketogenic therapy. So that's an easy synergy there between gluten intolerance and celiac disease and keto. All right, so let's take a look at what were some of the symptoms that improved for your children. We have a question here asking how you can tell when your child is improving. And so why don't you all share the top 3 things that were improvements for you, for your child, and how you noticed. Carrie, why don't you get us started?
Sure. I noticed within the first week of him entering ketosis that he was sleeping better, and he had never slept well in his life. And so just seeing more sleep and easier sleep, faster to get to sleep, and then actually staying asleep through the night, that was tremendous encouragement that we were on the right track. We did notice after probably about a month, it's like, oh, he's responding a little bit differently to some of his, what usually would have been triggering to him, asking him to do really just anything. And he would comply. Okay. And it's like, just really shocking, because that wasn't something that we experienced very often. But the most significant improvement that I can speak to is that, and we didn't know it right off the bat because we were watchfully waiting for the first couple of months, but he has, since entering ketosis, he has not had what I would consider a major manic or depressive episode. And the year prior to us entering into ketosis, he had had 4 major episodes, 2 of which were medication induced. The other 2, we have no idea what caused them. And 2 of them lasting at least 5 weeks total. And it's excruciating. So we were just, now in hindsight, I can say with certainty, like, this therapy is working because the cycling was happening frequently enough that we really should have seen another one by now. And he's not cycling anymore. I can say he's still irritable. We're still dealing with ADHD type symptoms, but those for our family are entirely manageable.
Angela, what about you? What are 3 things that were improvements?
Yeah, I think once we hit ketosis, we knew we were there. And when there were a couple days she would fall out and back in, it was obvious. Like, my husband and I would look at each other and be like, oh, I don't think she's in ketosis, because it was that drastic of a change in symptoms. Having 2 children in my home with bipolar, both unstable, at the time, was like constant oil being dumped on fire. They couldn't be in the same room together. They couldn't breathe the same air. They couldn't look at each other. God forbid they answered a question differently. Like it was just always chaos. And I remember a day shortly after she got into ketosis, she was sitting on the couch with her phone, and her brother was standing in front of her, picking the living tar out of her, trying to get a rise out of her. And in the past, this would have been a blow up. Things would have been flying. We would have had to intervene. And she was just sitting there scrolling her phone, didn't engage, didn't move, didn't anything. And that to me is like one of the prime moments to say, oh, something is working, because my children can breathe the same air and no one is getting beat from each other. So that piece, her ability to tolerate other people on an extreme level with her brother, and also just on a life level of, I don't like that person's voice or this person's talking too much. We all deal with that every day, but for her, that was not dealable. And so the ability to deal with those things was so huge. Further, having 5 children in a large family, we do travel often, even having a large family, but it became nearly impossible. It was just too overwhelming for the kids. It was too overwhelming to be in a different space, to not be getting the sleep we needed, all of that. So we often had to divvy up our children to be able to do fun activities, whether it was a day activity to the farm or going on vacation. We've taken several vacations without all of our children. And as a parent, that is heartbreaking. I don't want to be making these memories without everyone involved. And when she was in ketosis, we were able to do things as a family, even with my son not being stable, because she was able to maintain herself. And then we were able to focus energy on what we needed to maintain him. So the ability to just do family activities was ginormous. Third, I think one of the coolest things that I witnessed from her is she probably was one of the longer study participants to get into ketosis. She needed a couple kicks in the rear. And even once we were there, it was a lot of me reminding, a lot of me telling her, now remember, this is how you feel, because that's what I'm witnessing. And the moment that we saw that change in her move to intrinsic motivation and her making choices because I know I feel better when I make that choice, not because mom's telling me to eat this. Or I remember they were back to kind of the school issue, they were at a party and she had packed her lunch to go to the party. And it was like an afternoon activity. And a couple of weeks later, someone came up to me and was like, hey, I've been meaning to tell you, I was so impressed with your daughter at this party. I asked her, hey, do you have a food allergy? Or like, why you pack your lunch? Because I mean, there was a whole slew of things to eat. And she said, no, I do ketogenic therapy and it helps me not be angry and it helps keep me calm and feel better. And that was without prompting. It was without me saying, hey, pack your lunch because this. Like she took that initiative and she said that. So watching that intrinsic motivation just blossom and her want to make the choices was a pivotal moment as well.
Alyssa?
Well, I have more than 3, but I'll try to be quick. I know that
Take your time.
one of the first things that we noticed was his frustration tolerance was higher. Like it's things that we would typically say or do that we would then cringe and wait for something to happen. Then nothing happened. And we were like, did that just happen? Did that okay, that works. And his patience became he had more patience for things. He was starting to use his coping skills all on his own. No prompting, nothing. Putting himself in a reset area at school so he could calm himself down and then go back to what he was doing. Like that would never have happened any other year at all. And the school noticed that his communication had drastically improved. They were writing notes to us each day. Communication was off the charts, multiple times. And I mean, that's something that his expressive language is always something that we struggle with too. So um, that was really nice to see and hear. Clearly less aggression. I think this was the first April of 2025 was the first year that we did not have to hold our breath through with PRN meds and manic episode. Um, it was really nice. It's been years that we just kind of go through that, like walking on glass for the couple months. And then the last thing that was kind of a perk that we didn't really anticipate was he lost just over 50 pounds uh, on this during this study and is much more active, happier. Just a you can tell that he likes himself more and he is enjoying life more because he is asking to go and do things where the year before it was like pulling teeth to get him to do anything. So
That's
it was pretty
beautiful.
cool. Mm-hmm.
Carrie, we have a question specifically for you that came in from someone saying that their child is 8 and loves sweet treats. How were you with a younger child able to transition away from those sweet things?
Good question. My child is currently 7, and I had always tried to be careful with sugar just because my son was symptomatic since birth. And so I've been trying things for a long time. So he may not have as strong of a sweet tooth to begin with than some other children his age, but I can say the foods that we eat, some of them on a fairly regular basis, and we use sweeteners like monk fruit. That's my family's favorite. I've tried to stay with the more natural options with stevia or monk fruit. Um, we've made things like peanut butter butters, which is my son's favorite. That's also how I helped him to enter a deeper level of ketosis where his symptoms really dropped. And so that was his fat bomb that he likes for his good dreams. It's 2 tablespoons of salted butter and 2 tablespoons of unsweetened peanut butter, and I would put just a little scoop of monk fruit in it, or maybe some Lakanto maple syrup, the sugar-free maple syrup, just a tinge, because when your child adjusts to keto, their palate is much more sensitive to sweeteners, so you don't have to have the level of sweet that you used to when they adjust to ketogenic therapy. So that's just one example of a food that he eats regularly that he absolutely loves because he's young and I feel like he has a lot of struggles in life. Like I tell him, you're allowed to eat dessert first because his dessert is his fat bomb. And so that ensures that he's going to get a high enough ratio of fat in his meal. And we follow that with protein and his vegetables or fruits or whatever kind of plant-based option we have. And then again, like we talked about earlier, there's you have to look at the ratios. They're not perfect, but the Rebel brand of ice cream we have really enjoyed. One of the nice things about my son being younger is that I think his metabolism is still more flexible because he was able to consume the recommended limit of fruits and still stay plenty within ketosis. And as well as like one time he got into the fridge and ate an entire clamshell of blueberries or blackberries, I don't remember. And it was pretty early on. We were seeing improvements, and I was like, "Oh no!" And so we homeschool. I decided our homeschool today is going to be to go and play at the park. So he stayed active all day long, and his ketones were actually deeper, or he was deeper into ketosis that evening, and he sustained, the therapeutic effect. And so we have had to make so many changes in our family's life to be able to adjust to this, but I'm seeing them all as really positive changes, or well worthwhile changes. And so I think that there are very many delicious recipes that you can try, and your child may not like all of them, but you can just keep going until you find something that your child does like.
So this is a perfect segue, thank you, Carrie, into sort of not only our next topic, but in one of the questions that came in was about protein restriction, and that, we live in this culture now that is all about protein, protein, protein. You can get protein infused water. And so a lot of people think having sort of limited amounts of protein is going to, or balanced, as we say, amounts of protein might be difficult. So what is it that your kids actually ate or eat since they continue? What is it that they eat? What do they enjoy? Angela, you start.
I was just going to comment on the protein aspect because, again, reminding that we took the journey very slowly. And so we don't, even from the beginning, you don't just jump in. It's a slow process of changing like one meal at a time. My daughter initially was worried about what to eat. And so she found that she loved meatballs. And so she would eat meatballs multiple times a day, to the point that one day Elizabeth called me and said, Ange, I don't think you're tracking correctly. It says that she's had like 25 meatballs today. And I'm like, yeah, no, that's correct. She had them for breakfast, for lunch, for dinner, for a snack in between. And so she was very protein heavy in the beginning. But as she, again, got into ketosis, it was much easier to make those trade-offs. She doesn't eat like peanut butter or other available options. But she did do like peanuts and meat. And she just learned that, okay, I have to pair this with this or I'm not going to feel well about it. So, she loves her hamburgers. She loves her meat, but she knows now, like, okay, well, if I'm going to have that, I'm going to pair it with a salad with, several tablespoons of ranch dressing or whatnot. But I think overall for us, what we eat, we were probably the odd family in the group. We eat out far more than we should. And I think this is a concern for a lot of people that, I can't do this and be able to eat at restaurants. I can't do this and be able, well, I assure you, you can, because we did. There were some days that I was ashamed at what we ate, but it kept us in ketosis. And we learned what we could have at each restaurant, like Chick-fil-A, you can go with grilled nuggets and dip it in some ranch, or you can have a salad. We learned very quickly on what we could have. And we also learned, because you can't go to Chick-fil-A without having a couple of French fries. So how many French fries can we have without screwing it all up? So it's a very maintainable in that aspect. And my daughter was very good at going to a restaurant and looking and being like, okay, this is an option, this is an option, and this is an option. Even, if we were at a party at a major Italian restaurant, she was like, all right, meatballs it is. And my daughter loved her pasta. Like we started baseline at like 500 grams of carbs a day. And by the end, I think we made it to like 75 or something. So you just learn. And we learned, kind of like Carrie said, have dessert first. We learned that we kind of had to power up in the beginning of the day. So when the end of the day came and we weren't feeling as jovial about it, we weren't going to completely throw it all off track. And so the joke in our cohort was, I loved avocado oil. We put avocado oil in everything, on everything. And when I mean everything, my daughter drinks, she calls it her orange drink in the morning. It's water, orange flavoring, like sugar-free, Mio, avocado oil, and MCT oil. Straight, like she shakes it up and she drinks it. And that was a way to really get her macro ratio up at the beginning of the day. So when things went on through the day, it wasn't as difficult to maintain.
Excellent. Excellent. Carrie, what about you? Some more, other than the peanut butter, which I have to say is a fan with everyone in the study. Everyone wound up loving peanut butter.
Yes, I think it was Denise Potter that told me about peanut butter, and yeah, my whole family loves it. Um, my family was kind of the opposite. Like I've already said, we homeschool. We're a single income family. I stay home, and so and I have to say, Elizabeth was talking about why ketogenic therapy does not have to be expensive, and my family is a testament to that because for the first 2 months of the study, just by nature of my husband's job, we were not getting paid. And so we got really, really creative with how do we afford to let go of the beans and the rice and the pastas, which are very inexpensive, and go to fresh vegetables and fruits and meat. And like we ate a lot of chicken quarters, and I learned how to cook them where they actually taste good. So, one day my son actually just screamed in delight when he saw me bring, you know, chicken quarters out of the oven. And so this experience has really challenged my cooking skills. I thought I was a decent cook before, and now maybe I'm a decent cook, even though I've learned so much. Um, but so like I could get a 10-pound bag of chicken quarters at the grocery store for $5.72 and cook them in the oven. It did take a lot of time, but very, very hands off. And, salt it up and season it up. The drippings would come out. We'd add some cream, a bag of frozen mushrooms into that sauce. And that would feed my family for two, you know, very filling meals. The whole thing less than $10. Um, and so that's what I can speak to is that you can do this in an affordable way. My family doesn't go out to eat as often. And instead, when we are out and about, we've started to just use the grocery store like it is a restaurant. And so we go in and we find, a package of cheese or a package of like uncured salami or pepperoni, something that's got a higher fat content. I get the ranch that they can dip their vegetables in, get a little thing of organic fruit, and then we sit down at the tables in there and eat. And my kids are young enough and probably sheltered enough that they think that's wonderful. And so I really do think that I think any parent, if they sit down and really think about what works for their family, I suspect that they're going to find a way to make it work.
Alyssa, what about you? You said that your son will eat most everything, so you probably had a lot of variety that you could choose from.
We did. We did. I mean, our son now, things that I would never have bought before, like a rutabaga, will now walk around and eat raw rutabaga as I'm cutting it up, or he'll eat raw radishes. And has ranch, has a dip that he likes, spicy, he really likes a spicy mayo that we have. Um, so I mean, he can have endless amounts of the dips that he likes and the bacon and the sausage and the steaks and the hot dogs. Um, and so that was really nice. I mean, we went to a restaurant and at a restaurant here in town, you can get a plate of bacon that's like on their menu. And so like a year ago, we would have been like, ooh, we better not have him eat that whole plate of bacon. And now we're like, here you go. Here's a plate of bacon. Um, and then the other things like pancakes, waffles, there's ways to make things. There's ways to make those. Um, and he likes those just as much.
So, what would you all say to someone who was thinking about this and possibly intimidated about trying it? Carrie?
I would say it does take a lot of planning, but the difficulty in the planning is, in my family, completely offset by the reduction in his symptoms because life was just very hard. And so to me, it's like, if I can do planning, he's getting relief, the whole family's getting relief. We're still, we're gaining functionality, and I'm gaining time and gaining peace. So that's well worth it for me. But I also want to just assure parents that are interested that there are so many shortcuts. You can go to the extreme on cooking everything from scratch, 3 full meals a day, or you can get really good at batch cooking using crock pots, instant pot, um, finding options outside of the home. Some of the other things that my family really likes is like a ground beef taco salad, queso burgers, fajita bowls, really, really delicious food that we're genuinely enjoying. And then, like Alyssa was saying, our meals sometimes are so simple. If all that I have the time for is to get a plate of bacon or a plate of scrambled eggs on the dinner table, it's like, that's what we have. And it's not every meal. They still get variety in other meals. But I used to be so nervous about feeding that kind of stuff to my children. And now I know that it's extremely nutritionally dense, and that I'm just seeing the benefits of my child getting much better nutrition now. And so I'm feeling so much more comfortable about meals that may look different from other people's.
Angela?
Yeah, I think I want people to know most that it's maintainable. That it may be difficult in the beginning, especially if your child is not stable. And you do have to work through that, but it is maintainable through school. It is maintainable through holiday parties. It is maintainable through vacation. I went to Africa for 12 days and maintained ketosis. And if you've ever been to Africa or know anything about Africa, it's a lot of rice and posho, which is like wallpaper paste. I'm sure it's all carbs. So it is not really that easy to find what you need there. But with pre-planning, like Carrie said, all of those things are possible. And, I see in the chat, someone said, how do you find the time and energy to basically make most things from scratch? I assure you, I made next to nothing from scratch. I was not the cooking person of the group. I abhor cooking. My husband actually has taken on a lot of the baking. He makes muffins and different keto things, but it doesn't have to be, these fancy recipes from scratch. We would talk about them in group and I'd be like, that sounds wonderful. I wish I lived closer to you all so you could make it for me, because I'm not doing it myself. There's options out there that it's possible without having to do that. Does it still take planning? Absolutely. Does it still take forethought? Absolutely. But it doesn't mean that I'm 13 hours in the kitchen every day.
And one thing that I wanted to add to that is that, and this is, and maybe you guys can speak to this, but I would say over and over again, once you're in ketosis and you've been there for a while, the appetite decreases. You are eating food that is more dense nutritionally with the high quantity of fat. And so you won't eat as much, you won't eat as frequently. And most of the time, the response I got was, yeah, right. But it does, in fact, turn out to be true. And so there's a lot of work. I observed that the work was front loaded at the beginning as people got acclimated to what types of sweeteners that won't trigger an insulin response will my child tolerate and enjoy the taste of, and what types of, as they're sort of branching out. But once you really get into ketosis and are there, you're eating less frequently, there's less to prepare. Meals become in many ways much more simple, not because they're restricted, but because you don't have to have an entree with 4 side dishes and dessert. You have a single pot meal, as Carrie described, with the chicken quarters, and you take the drippings and you add some cream and some frozen mushrooms, and there you go. You have a dinner. So it's less. It's still from scratch, but it's less work, and there's less of it to do. There's a question here about do you focus on carb limit intake or ratios? So our ratio, as I put in the presentation, is fat divided by combined protein plus carbohydrates. So if you are eating something that has 20 grams of fat, 5 grams of protein, and 5 grams of carbohydrates, you add the 5 grams of protein to the 5 grams of carbohydrates, you get 10. You divide 10 into those 20 grams of fat, and that's a 2-to-1 ratio. And so we're not counting carbs, quite the opposite. We're counting fat to make sure that we're getting enough fat. And so one of the things that we also shared with folks at the beginning was over and over saying, don't try to find replacements for the things your child likes. If they really like pasta, don't try to find some keto compliant pasta for them to eat that has fewer carbs in it, because they're not going to like it. It's not going to go well. Find things that naturally adhere to the ketogenic therapy plan that they already like and let them eat that instead. And yet, does it mean that they might eat a little too much bacon at the beginning? Yes. But once it kicks them into ketosis, they're going to stop craving those carbohydrates and they're going to want other foods. And so you're counting the fat. We always used to say that your fat count is a minimum and your protein and carbohydrate counts are a maximum. So that's how we count. And once you get the hang of it, it's pretty simple. There's a question here about medications and any plans that anybody may have to need to reduce any medications or change any medications. Not everyone came into the study to medicated in the first place. So that is a personal decision that is made with the family, the child, and their provider. And what I will say is that, and I put this into one of the answers, was that when you get into ketosis, you are, when you get into ketosis, you are, you become more sensitive to things. You become more sensitive to caffeine. You become more sensitive to alcohol. If you're an adult and you consume alcohol, you become more sensitive to your medications. And so it does become necessary at some point for some people, as their sensitivity increases, that they can actually get by on a lower dose of a medication with the same positive effect from the medication, because they don't need the medication to be as high as it was. And Angela, I just want to say thank you for grounding us in the reality of our lives as parents, that our children come and go and do as they please. Very humanizing. So thank you for that. You put your hand up, though. You wanted to share something.
Yes, of course, I apologize.
No apology
but
necessary. That's who we are.
I did want to speak to the medication piece. My daughter was on, I feel like, a slew of medications, and we were able to titrate off of 3 different medications when we started ketosis and got into ketosis. And that was huge, because there was quite a point that it felt like professionals were just throwing more at us because we didn't know what to do. And so the opportunity to bring that down to a more manageable level and a more appropriate level because of being in ketosis was incredible.
It is emotional hearing the stories from families, to be able to realize that there are tools that you have, that you can access right at home without a doctor's prescription, that can make life better, is hopefully very empowering for families. Yeah, so if there aren't any other questions, we will wrap up for tonight. Thank everyone for being with us. And please feel free to check out further opportunities on our website, and with us on our social media pages. We're here to help. So don't hesitate to reach out. Carrie, Alyssa, Angela, thank you so much for being here, for sharing your stories, for being inspiring to others. And thank you for the faith you put in us to go on this journey with us with your children.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. We hope to see you all next time, and have a great rest of your evening.